The clinking of cutlery on ceramic echoed in the quiet dining room. Nathan glanced across the table at Zara, who sat silently, her gaze fixed on her phone, fingers flicking across the screen. "You're really absorbed there," Nathan remarked, keeping his voice light. He took a slow sip of water, eyes watching her reaction over the rim of his glass. Zara looked up, a flicker of surprise on her face, quickly replaced by a half-hearted smile. "Sorry, just work stuff," she replied, slipping the phone face down on the table. "There's been a lot going on lately. Late nights, too," Nathan noted, laying his fork down. "Is that why you've been coming home so late?" Zara let out a sigh, pushing her salad around with her fork. "Yes, it's been hectic. I can barely keep up. If you'd seen the mess in the office, you'd understand." Nathan nodded, but a quiet unease settled in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, even as she tried to sound reassuring. "I could drop by sometime, bring you dinner," he offered, hoping to gauge her response. "Oh no, that's really not necessary," she replied quickly, a hint of tension creeping into her voice. "Besides, you know how strict they are about guests in the office." He gave a slow nod, sensing her unease grow. He picked up his fork again and continued eating, letting the silence stretch out between them. She was always glancing at her phone, and when it vibrated softly on the table, she reached for it almost reflexively. "It's just Laura," she explained, though Nathan hadn't asked. "She's been needing advice with her relationship issues." She chuckled, though the sound was strained. "Guess I'm her unofficial therapist now." "Is that right?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "She must be going through quite a bit if she needs you that often." Zara shrugged, her gaze falling away. "Yeah, she's in a tough spot." Nathan kept his face neutral, but his mind buzzed with questions. He'd known Laura for years, and she'd never once sought Zara's advice on relationships. His gut twisted as he wondered if the real reason she was on edge had nothing to do with work or Laura. As dinner wound down, Nathan offered to wash the dishes. He stacked their plates and took them to the sink, glancing back to see her back to her phone, the dim light reflecting off her face. The knot in his chest tightened. After a few minutes, she wandered into the living room, settling onto the couch. Nathan dried his hands and joined her. "I'm glad you're here tonight," he said, trying to gauge her reaction again. She looked over, forcing a smile. "Of course. Where else would I be?" Nathan's eyes flicked to her phone, resting on her lap. "So, do you want to watch a movie?" She hesitated. "Actually, I'm a little tired. I was thinking of going to bed early tonight." She shifted, pulling a thin blanket over herself. "Maybe tomorrow?" He masked his disappointment with a nod. "Sure, maybe tomorrow." They sat in silence, and Nathan watched as she dozed off, her face peaceful, untouched by any apparent strain. He couldn't help but feel the chill of the distance growing between them, a space that seemed to widen by the day. When she finally retreated to the bedroom, her phone clutched in her hand, he felt a surge of frustration he didn't dare voice. The next morning, Nathan awoke to an empty bed. Zara had left early, a note on the kitchen counter saying she'd gone to the office to prepare for a big project. Nathan stared at the note, her handwriting neat and poised. He reached for his phone and opened his calendar. She hadn't mentioned any project deadlines this week. He took a breath, telling himself he was just being paranoid. But the thought lingered. Throughout the day, little things kept nagging at him. He remembered moments when Zara's gaze would linger on her phone, her excuses growing flimsier with each passing day. When she did come home that evening, he decided he needed to ask her, once and for all. As she settled in for dinner, Nathan took a deep breath. "Zara, are you sure everything's okay?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Why do you ask?" "I just feel like," he searched for the right words, "like something's changed. I feel like we're not as close as we used to be." She looked down, fidgeting with her fork. "I'm just stressed, Nathan. I told you. It's work. Sometimes it takes everything out of me." He studied her, waiting for her to meet his gaze. When she finally did, he saw a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, or maybe just discomfort. He couldn't be sure. "If you ever needed to talk, you'd tell me, right?" She nodded a little too quickly. "Of course." But that night, as she slipped away to take another work call, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. His mind started piecing together little moments, Every odd glance, every evasive answer. The next day, he decided to act. During his lunch break, he pulled up her calendar on the shared app they used. It was as blank as he'd suspected. He felt his pulse quicken, the doubts transforming into something sharper, more insistent. When she got home that night, he tried to act casual. "How was the project?" he asked, careful to keep his voice steady. "Oh, exhausting," she replied, barely glancing up from her phone. "Anything I can help with?" he pressed. "No, it's just boring stuff. You'd hate it." She gave a small, dismissive laugh, but he caught the nervous edge behind it. As she retreated to the bedroom, he took a deep breath. He could feel the trust they'd built over the years slipping away, replaced by a growing suspicion he couldn't ignore. After a long moment, he followed her down the hallway. In the doorway, he stopped. "Zara," he began, watching as she looked up in surprise. "Are you sure there's nothing you're hiding from me?" Her expression faltered, just for a split second, before she forced a smile. "Nathan, what's gotten into you?" He held her gaze, searching for any sign of honesty. But all he found was a wall of practiced calm. She moved toward him, placing her hand on his arm. "I love you. Don't doubt that." He swallowed, nodding slowly, but his heart was heavy with unanswered questions. Nathan sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at Zara's laptop in front of him. She had left for work, her usual hasty goodbye leaving him with an empty sense of unease. His fingers hovered over the keys, his mind racing with doubt and guilt. But his instincts nudged him forward. "One look," he murmured to himself, barely above a whisper. "Just one?" He opened her email. A pang of shame hit him, but he shook it off. His hands moved quickly, checking her inbox and sent folders, scanning the emails. Nothing unusual jumped out at first, just a series of work-related exchanges. Then he saw it. A few email threads titled Meeting Follow-Up with one particular name recurring, Sean Langston. Nathan's brow furrowed. Sean was one of her co-workers, someone she'd mentioned only casually over the past few months. He clicked the latest email thread. The message was formal, but something about it felt off, a subtle warmth that didn't belong in a work email. Closing the laptop, Nathan took a steadying breath. He leaned back, drumming his fingers on the table as a creeping feeling of dread curled in his gut. He needed more, something concrete. That evening, while Zara was in the shower, he moved to her purse, slipping her phone from it. His heart pounded as he opened her messages and scrolled to Sean's name. Most of the messages were casual, yet there were gaps in their exchanges. Long pauses where she'd sent no message to him. He checked the photos. Some were selfies from their dates, but hidden among them was a shot she had taken of herself in a hotel room mirror, wearing a familiar red dress he hadn't seen in months. The following day, Nathan called Zara's workplace, casually asking about her last project. "Oh, Zara wrapped that up a while back," her coworker told him. Nathan's heart sank. Hours later, his chance came. Zara had once given him her online banking password, back when they'd handled the mortgage paperwork together. He logged in, guilt tightening around him as he scanned through her expenses. A charge at a hotel appeared, dated just last week. "She never mentioned a hotel stay," he muttered, his voice hollow. The same name, the same hotel, kept reappearing over the last few months. He stared at the receipts, the timeline of charges unfolding before him like a list of betrayals. Room service, dinners, reservations at nearby restaurants. Each expense, a pinprick of anger. At the end of the day, Zara came home, looking tired. "Long day?" Nathan asked, keeping his voice steady. She nodded, barely glancing at him as she slipped off her shoes. "Exhausting?" He nodded, watching her closely. "I was thinking maybe we could take a weekend together soon. Just the two of us." Her eyes flicked to him, surprised. "Oh, I'm sure. That'd be nice. You wouldn't have to work?" he pressed, searching her face. She hesitated just for a second. "No, I can make time. It would be good for us." The unease in her eyes was impossible to ignore. He clenched his fists, every fiber of him itching to confront her then and there. But he held back. As she walked into the bedroom, Nathan sat down, his mind working furiously. He couldn't let her keep getting away with this. She had lied, pretended, played him for a fool, and he wouldn't let it slide. But there was no point in exploding now. Instead, a plan started to take shape. That night, After Zara had fallen asleep, Nathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He had to make sure she would never forget what she had done. She needed to understand the depth of her betrayal. Every text she had hidden, every excuse she'd given, every meeting she'd pretended to go to, she'd see it all reflected back at her, without escape. The next morning, he was up before dawn, his mind sharp with determination. He made a few calls, arranging the pieces. By the time Zara woke up, he was in the kitchen, setting out breakfast like it was any other day. She sat down, yawning. "You're up early?" "Couldn't sleep," he said simply, not looking at her. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it before quickly flipping it over. Nathan didn't miss the fleeting guilt that crossed her face, and it only strengthened his resolve. "You're checking your phone a lot these days," he said, his tone casual. "It's just work," she replied quickly, taking a bite of toast. "Things have been hectic." "I see," he said, nodding. "Maybe I should check in with you at work sometime. Bring you a coffee, surprise you?" She froze, and the lies slipped out before she could even think. "Actually, we're not allowed visitors. New policy." He held back a grim smile. "Right? The no visitors policy." Her shoulders tensed slightly, but she gave him a tight smile. "Exactly." After she left for work, Nathan sat in the empty kitchen, listening to the quiet. The pieces of his plan fell into place one by one, until it felt solid, inescapable. That night, Nathan waited up for her, knowing she'd return later than usual. When Zara finally walked in, her gaze was distant, her smile forced. "You're still up?" she asked, feigning surprise. "I thought we could talk," he said, gesturing to the couch. She hesitated, but sat down, looking uncomfortable. "What's going on?" she asked, crossing her arms, her gaze wary. Nathan studied her, his face a mask. "Are you sure you're happy, Zara?" Her brow furrowed. "Of course. Why would you ask that?" "Because," he paused, leaning forward. "You seem distracted, distant. And I don't want to accuse you of anything, but I think we need to be honest with each other." She swallowed, shifting on the couch. "I don't know what you're talking about, Nathan." "Don't you?" he asked quietly. "Because I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Her gaze dropped to her lap, and he saw her hands clenched together. For a moment, he almost softened, almost believed her act of innocence. But then he remembered the hotel receipts, the lies, and his resolve hardened. "I think we need to have a talk," he continued, his voice calm but unwavering. "About where we're going, about what we want." "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He sighed, standing up. "You know, Zara, I always thought honesty was important to us. I thought we had that." She looked up at him, eyes wide, her mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. He could see the mask finally cracking, the fear surfacing. For the first time, she seemed to sense just how much he knew. Nathan walked to the door, turning back to her once before he stepped out. "We'll talk soon, Zara," he said, his voice firm. "When you're ready to be honest." And with that, he left, knowing it was only a matter of time before she would see just how much she'd underestimated him. Nathan's fingers trembled as he held the contract in his hands, the final piece of his plan falling into place. The camera crew was briefed, instructed to act as though they were documenting his surprise renovation. A pretext, but it was the perfect cover. They'd arrive at his house at the precise time he knew Zara would be there, along with her co-worker, Sean. It was all set. The lead cameraman, a tall man named Jerry, gave him a thumbs up. "Don't worry, Nathan. We'll make this an unforgettable reveal," he chuckled, thinking it was all part of a show. Nathan managed a small smile, barely masking the intensity beneath. "Perfect. Just follow my cue when I call," he said, his voice low. "Make sure you capture everything." Jerry nodded, oblivious. "We got it. Should be fun." Nathan's heart pounded as he left the set, his face stony. Outside, he stood in the driveway for a long moment, breathing deeply, preparing himself for what was to come. On the day of the reveal, Nathan spent hours pacing. His watch ticked slowly toward the afternoon, each second feeling like a weight pressing down on him. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his messages. No word from Zara. No changes in her demeanor. No hint that she suspected anything unusual. When the clock struck 4 p.m., he took a deep breath, dialing her number. His hand clenched around the phone as it rang once, twice. Finally, she picked up. "Hey," she answered, sounding slightly breathless. He could hear muffled sounds in the background, voices, laughter. "Zara," he said, keeping his tone even. "I hope you're ready for a surprise on tonight." There was a pause, and he could almost feel the way her mood shifted on the other end. "A surprise?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Yes," he replied smoothly. "I've arranged something special for you at home. Thought you'd like it." She laughed nervously, trying to play along. "Really? That's sweet, Nathan. I'll be home soon." "Great," he said, allowing a hint of irony to slip into his voice. "Can't wait to see your reaction." With that, he hung up, his jaw tightening as he tucked the phone back into his pocket. He could picture her, wide-eyed, wondering what he knew, or if he knew at all. At precisely 4:30, the camera crew arrived. They moved efficiently, setting up the lights, positioning cameras around the living room, the hallway, and as Nathan had planned, directly facing the master bedroom. Jerry shot Nathan a quizzical glance. "You're sure this is how you want it?" Jerry asked, adjusting a tripod. Nathan nodded. "I want every moment recorded." The crew members exchanged amused glances, thinking this was all part of the act. But Nathan's gaze stayed fixed on the house. Every step he took felt heavy, but he kept his mind focused. This was no longer about anger. It was about justice, about exposing the truth that she had buried beneath layers of lies. It was a little after 5 o'clock when he saw the car pull up. From his hiding spot across the street, he saw Zara step out, her usual smile plastered on her face. Then Sean stepped out after her, and they exchanged a glance, one that would have looked innocent to anyone else, but Nathan saw it all. The stolen touches, the quiet laughter. His hands balled into fists as he watched them disappear inside. He took a breath, his hand hovering over his phone. One call would set everything in motion. Nathan's heart beat steadily as he approached the house, the quiet calm within him masking the storm beneath the surface. The camera crew followed close behind, keeping to their roles as though this were any other reality TV segment. He could already feel the tension mounting, the anticipation building as they stepped through the front door. "Ready?" Jerry asked, his voice low. Nathan nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's go." They moved through the silent hallway, each step intensifying the pounding in Nathan's chest. As they approached the closed bedroom door, muffled laughter and hushed voices filtered through the walls. Nathan's lips tightened into a thin line, his grip on the doorknob firm as he turned to the crew. "When I open this door, start recording." Jerry gave him a thumbs up, his camera poised and ready. With a sharp twist, Nathan swung the door open, stepping into the bedroom as the bright lights of the cameras flooded the space. Inside the bedroom, Zara laughed, looking back at Sean with a playful grin. She tossed her purse onto the couch, her fingers brushing against his as they slipped off their shoes. It was routine by now, stolen hours of familiar comfort. But her phone buzzed. She frowned, pulling it out to see Nathan's name flashing on the screen. "Hold on," she whispered to Sean, holding up a finger. Her heart raced as she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hey, Nathan," she said, forcing lightness into her tone. "I hope you're ready for a surprise," he said, his voice sharp. Her heart dropped. "A surprise? Right now?" "Yes. It's just for you," he replied with a disturbing calmness. Before she could answer, the door swung open. Zara turned, eyes widening as she saw Nathan standing in the doorway, a half-smirk on his face, followed by a camera crew. Panic flashed across her face, her gaze darting to Sean, who stared at Nathan, frozen. The scene inside hit like a punch. There was Zara, caught in a twisted embrace with Sean, both frozen in shock as they registered the intrusion. The bed covers tangled around them, and Zara's expression shifted from confusion to horror as she realized what was happening. Her face paled, her mouth hanging open as she stared, wide-eyed, at the camera crew and, finally, at Nathan. Nathan took a step forward, his voice calm and laced with irony. "Smile, Zara. You're on live TV." Zara scrambled back, grabbing for the sheets, her hands shaking as she struggled to cover herself. "Nathan, what is this?" she stammered, her eyes darting between him and the camera. "Oh, just a little home project I've been working on," he replied, folding his arms. Thought it would be nice for everyone to see what happens when trust is broken. Sean, red-faced and panicked, fumbled with his clothes. He grabbed his shirt from the floor, pulling it over his head in a rush. This is insane, he muttered, half-dressed and already stumbling toward the window. His gaze shot to Nathan, desperation clear in his eyes. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Leaving already, Sean? I thought you and Zara had some unfinished business. Sean stammered, backing up as he clumsily pulled his pants on. I need to get out of here. Nathan stepped aside with a cold smile, gesturing toward the door. Be my guest. I'm sure the neighborhood will enjoy the show. Sean didn't need further encouragement. Half-dressed and humiliated, he darted toward the door, only to realize the camera crew had blocked his exit. He shot Nathan a desperate look. Can you just let me out? Nathan inclined his head, giving Jerry a nod. The crew shifted aside, allowing Sean to make his escape. He bolted down the hallway, nearly slipping as he stumbled out the front door, right into the curious stares of the neighbors who had gathered outside, drawn by the commotion. The sound of murmuring voices outside drifted back into the bedroom, each whisper a reminder of the public humiliation Zara and Sean had brought upon themselves. Zara was left alone, wrapped in the tangled sheets, her face drained of color. She looked at Nathan, her eyes wide with desperation. Nathan, please let me explain. He stared back, his gaze cold and unyielding. Explain? He repeated, his voice sharp. Go on then. Explain to me why I found you here with him. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She struggled to speak, tripping over half-formed excuses. It was a mistake, Nathan, I swear. It didn't mean anything. I was confused. Nathan shook his head, the bitterness in his smile unmistakable. Confused? That's your excuse? You weren't confused when you lied to my face, or when you sneaked around with him. Zara's eyes filled with tears, her shoulders shaking as she clutched the sheets tighter. Please, I know I messed up. I didn't want it to end like this. Nathan's gaze remained steady, unmoved by her tears. You should have thought about that before. I trusted you, Zara. I believed in us, in everything we'd built together. And this is what you did with it. Her lip quivered, and she reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to close the distance between them. Nathan, I still love you. I got lost, okay? But I want to make it right. He stepped back, folding his arms. Love? Do you even understand what that word means, Zara? Because if this is how you show it, then I'm glad to know now. She choked back a sob, her hand dropping as the reality of his words hit her. Nathan, please, just give me a chance to make it up to you. Nathan let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head slowly. A chance? After everything you've done? You think I'd give you the satisfaction? The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by Zara's quiet, ragged breathing. The weight of her betrayal hung between them, heavy and irrevocable. Nathan turned to Jerry and the rest of the crew, his voice calm but resolute. You all got what you needed? Jerry nodded, the camera still trained on Zara's devastated face. Yes, we're good. Powerful footage here, Nathan. Good, Nathan replied, casting one last look at Zara. Because this is over. All of it. He turned on his heel, walking out of the room with the crew close behind him, leaving Zara alone, wrapped in sheets and regret. As the front door closed behind them, Nathan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past months begin to lift. The following morning, Nathan sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee in silence. His mind was blank, an eerie calm settled over him as he processed the night before. He'd barely slept, the images of Zara and Sean burned into his mind. For the first time in a long while, he felt no pull toward the woman he'd once loved. Just then, soft footsteps echoed from the hallway, followed by a hesitant knock on the doorframe. Nathan didn't look up. He knew it was her. Nathan. Zara's voice wavered, barely above a whisper. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the coffee swirling in his mug. Zara took a few steps forward, her face swollen from a night of crying. Please, she murmured, her voice breaking. I know I don't deserve it, but could we talk? He finally raised his eyes, his expression unreadable. Talk? About what, Zara? She swallowed, her hands fidgeting as she took a few more steps closer. About us. About what I did. You mean what you did, he corrected coldly, his voice sharp as a blade. This isn't about us. This is about you. Her lip quivered, and she quickly bit down, willing herself not to cry. I know. I know I messed up, Nathan. But please, I need you to understand. What is there to understand, Zara? He snapped, slamming his mug onto the table. You lied to me again and again. You betrayed everything we built together. You didn't just destroy our marriage. You destroyed any respect I had for you. The weight of his words seemed to crush her, and she lowered herself to the ground, kneeling before him. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She reached out, her hand hovering over his before pulling back, afraid he'd pull away. If I could take it all back, I would. I was lost, Nathan. I made a horrible mistake. A mistake, he repeated, his tone bitter. Sleeping with another man, lying to me day after day, that's a mistake? Tears streamed down her face, and she wiped at them desperately, as though trying to erase her shame. Please, Nathan, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't lose you. I'll do anything. I'll change. I'll let you control everything. Just tell me what to do, and I'll do it. I'll be the wife you deserve. Just don't leave me. Nathan stared at her, his expression hardening as she pleaded. He wanted to feel something, pity, anger, compassion. But all he felt was emptiness. Zara, do you even hear yourself? You're asking me to forgive you after everything you put me through. After the lies, the deceit, the humiliation. She gripped his hand now, not caring if he pulled away. Her eyes searched his face desperately. Please, Nathan. We've been through so much together. I know I hurt you, but we can rebuild. I'll earn your trust back. I swear it. He slowly pulled his hand away, his gaze never leaving hers. Zara, trust isn't something you just earn back. It's not a game you play where you reset after you lose. You chose to betray me. You knew the risks, and you did it anyway. Her breath caught, and she clutched her hands together, trembling. I know, Nathan. I was selfish. I was wrong. I let things get out of hand, but I never stopped loving you. Nathan laughed bitterly. Love? Do you call what you did love? Because if that's love, then I don't want any part of it. She flinched, visibly hurt by his words, but she didn't give up. Nathan, please think of all the memories we have, all the plans we made. We can start over. I'll go to therapy. I'll do anything you ask. I'll prove to you that I'm still the woman you fell in love with. He shook his head, looking away. The woman I fell in love with wouldn't have done this, Zara. She wouldn't have hurt me this way. I don't even recognize you anymore. Zara covered her face with her hands, sobbing openly now. I know I've lost your trust, but if you give me just one more chance, I promise I won't disappoint you. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. For a moment, he considered her offer. A part of him, the part that still remembered their good times, wanted to believe her. But he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that things would never be the same. I can't do it, Zara, he said quietly, his voice heavy with finality. Even if I tried, I'd never be able to forget. Every time I look at you, I'll remember what you did. I can't live like that. Zara looked up at him, the hope in her eyes fading as his words sank in. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. The weight of her own actions had finally caught up with her, and the reality of losing him settled over her like a cold shadow. Nathan, she whispered, reaching for him one last time, but he stepped back, avoiding her touch. This isn't something you can fix, Zara. You broke something in me, something I don't think I'll ever get back. He paused, his voice softening slightly. I loved you. I gave you everything, and you threw it away for... What a thrill. She shook her head, fresh tears spilling over. It wasn't like that. It wasn't about you. It was my own mistake, my own weakness. Please, Nathan, just give me a chance to make this right. But Nathan's gaze stayed cold, unmoved. No, Zara, this is where it ends. I deserve better than this. Her shoulders slumped, and she crumpled, defeated, onto the floor. The weight of his words settled over her like a lead blanket, and for the first time, she seemed to understand the gravity of what she'd done. Nathan watched her for a moment, the woman he'd once loved, now a stranger to him. Then, Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. As he reached the doorway, she called out one last time, her voice hoarse. "Please, Nathan, I love you." He stopped, looking back at her, his expression unreadable. "Love isn't enough, Zara. Not after this." With that, he stepped out, leaving her alone in the silence of the empty house, the echoes of his footsteps fading as the door closed behind him. Nathan left the house that day with a finality that silenced any thoughts of looking back. Each step away felt like a piece of weight lifted off him, one fragment of a broken past at a time. His decision was resolute, his heart steeled against the pleas, apologies, and empty promises Zara had left him with. As for Zara, the fallout was immediate. The affair had gone public, thanks to the leaked footage of her betrayal. Her family, friends, and colleagues heard whispers, and soon enough, those whispers grew into full-blown knowledge. Every look she received at work carried judgment, disappointment, and a thinly veiled disgust. By mid-morning, she walked into the office only to find a handful of her closest colleagues looking away, unwilling to make eye contact. She tried to ignore it, forcing a smile as she approached Morgan, one of her longtime friends. But Morgan's smile was tense, her eyes sharp with accusation. "Zara," Morgan began, her tone hard. "I can't believe you would do something like this. Nathan trusted you. We all did." Zara swallowed, feeling her face flush. "Morgan, please. I know I messed up, but it's complicated. You wouldn't understand." Morgan crossed her arms, her expression unmoving. "What's complicated, Zara? You cheated on a good man. I don't think there's anything to understand." Before Zara could respond, Sean entered the room, and the whispers grew louder. People quickly turned their backs, muttering as he walked past them, his face red. He could barely meet her gaze as he sidled over to his desk. His usually confident stride was absent, replaced with the hesitant steps of a man weighed down by guilt. During lunch, the office was abuzz with conversation. Colleagues gathered in small groups, casting wary glances toward Zara and Sean. Sean attempted to maintain his composure, but the pressure was mounting. By the end of the day, he was called into a meeting with his supervisor. His once promising career was now hanging by a thread. Hours later, after the dust had settled and the office had mostly cleared out, Zara found herself at her desk, her head in her hands. She had gone from respected to shunned in mere days. Her boss had already hinted that perhaps she should take some time off. Her fingers trembled as she picked up her phone, scrolling through unread messages and missed calls from family and friends. One message from her father was short but scathing. "How could you do this to him, Zara? You brought shame on us all." She closed her eyes, taking in a deep breath. Every bridge she had with the people closest to her felt like it was crumbling, piece by piece. The sharp pang of regret was almost unbearable. Desperate, she texted Nathan one more time. "Please, I know you don't owe me anything, but I need to talk to you. One last time." She waited, staring at the screen, but there was no response. The next day, Zara tried to meet with Nathan. She drove to his favorite cafe, hoping that maybe he'd be there, but he wasn't. Then she went to their old apartment, hesitating at the door as she thought of all the memories they'd shared within those walls. Steeling herself, she knocked softly. After a moment, the door opened, and Nathan stood there, his face impassive. "Zara." She opened her mouth to speak, but the coldness in his gaze silenced her. Finally, she forced herself to speak. "Nathan, I know I've said this before, but I need to tell you how sorry I am. If there's anything I can do to make this right." He raised a hand, cutting her off. "Make it right." He shook his head. "Zara, there's nothing you can do to make it right. You chose this, and I'm not here to give you closure. I'm done with this conversation." She took a step forward, her eyes pleading. "Please, Nathan, I know I hurt you, but we had so many good years together. Don't you remember?" He let out a harsh laugh, his gaze unwavering. "Of course I remember, Zara. I remember all of it, the good and the bad. And I remember trusting you, believing you'd never do what you did. But you broke that, and now you have to live with it." Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced herself to keep speaking. "Nathan, please. I'm begging you. Just one more chance. But Nathan's expression remained stony, his voice steady. I told you before, Zara. There are some things that can't be undone. You think I can just forget everything you put me through? I deserve better than this. Zara's shoulders slumped, defeat finally sinking in. I understand. I didn't think it would end like this. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, his voice soft but firm. Neither did I, Zara. But here we are. He nodded once, a finality to his tone. Goodbye, Zara. He shut the door, leaving her standing alone on the doorstep, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She lingered there for a few moments before finally turning and walking away, feeling the cold realization that her actions had led her here. Back in the office, things continued to spiral for both Zara and Sean. Word had spread quickly about the affair, and each of them received a formal notice from HR, their professional reputations tarnished beyond repair. Sean's name was already being whispered in other offices, his career effectively ended. Zara, once a respected member of her team, now faced a lonely existence, her colleagues' sympathy long replaced by disdain. Socially, too, Zara found herself isolated. Friends stopped returning her calls, family gatherings became strained, and the people she'd once trusted to stand by her found reasons to avoid her. The weight of her choices grew heavier with every passing day. And as for Nathan, he moved forward, finally free from the tangled mess of his past. He surrounded himself with new friends, immersed himself in work, and slowly began to rebuild his life. The pain of betrayal faded over time, replaced by a sense of relief, of having escaped a life of deceit. One afternoon, while sitting alone in a cafe, he received a message from an old friend. Just wanted you to know, she's trying to reach out to some of your friends, hoping to explain herself. Nathan took a sip of his coffee, his lips curving into a small, indifferent smile. He felt no need to respond. He was done with that chapter of his life, and he wasn't about to let it haunt him any longer. Nathan adjusted to his new life at a steady pace, finding peace in the quiet routines that gradually replaced the upheaval of recent months. One Saturday morning, he found himself at his favorite coffee shop, where he could sit in a corner booth, relax with a book, and simply breathe. He didn't expect anyone to notice him, let alone start a conversation. But as he flipped through the pages of his book, he heard a friendly voice. Mind if I sit here? It's a bit crowded today, the woman asked with a warm smile, gesturing toward the chair across from him. Nathan looked up, slightly surprised, but he nodded. Of course, go ahead. She settled in with her coffee, her attention immediately drawn to the book he was reading. Oh, I love that author. They really know how to write about people. It's like they understand what makes them tick. Nathan chuckled. Yeah, that's exactly why I like their work. It feels real. She extended her hand, her smile widening. I'm Morgan, by the way. Nathan, he replied, shaking her hand. They continued chatting, moving from books to favorite movies and small talk about the neighborhood. It had been a while since Nathan felt this at ease with someone. He didn't try too hard, didn't feel like he had to put on any kind of front. They laughed at small jokes, shared stories, and for a while, he forgot the hurt he'd been carrying. As the conversation flowed, Nathan felt a surprising warmth. Morgan listened intently, her eyes filled with curiosity and kindness. There was something genuine about her presence, a lightness that felt calming. So, she said with a grin, stirring her coffee, tell me the craziest thing you've ever done. He laughed, thinking about it. Probably taking a road trip on a whim. Just packed up and drove west without much of a plan. I just needed a change at the time. Her eyes lit up. Sounds amazing. I think I'd love the freedom of that. Life throws so many things at us. Sometimes it's nice to get away. Nathan nodded. Yeah, I learned a lot about myself on that trip. He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But something about Morgan felt safe, like he didn't need to guard his words so tightly. It was right after a rough breakup. Her expression softened. I'm sorry. Those are hard. But I believe they teach us something too. I've had my share of rough goodbyes. Their eyes met, and Nathan found himself sharing a quiet understanding with her, one that didn't need to be spelled out. They both carried scars, reminders of past trust broken. Yet here they were, meeting someone new and perhaps hoping for a different kind of ending. In the weeks that followed, Nathan and Morgan saw each other often. They met for coffee, shared casual dinners, and eventually they planned a hike together. On the trail, they fell into a steady rhythm, the conversation flowing as easily as the landscape unfolded around them. As they walked, Morgan asked, "What's something you want to do but never have?" Nathan thought for a moment. "Honestly, I'd love to try skydiving. Always seemed terrifying but thrilling, like a way to feel alive." Morgan laughed. "I've been once. It's a mix of screaming and laughing all the way down, but it's amazing. We should go. It'll be an adventure." Nathan looked at her, genuinely amused. "You'd actually go with me?" She shrugged, a playful glint in her eye. "Why not? Life's too short to hesitate. Besides, it'll be a good story." Her confidence was contagious, and Nathan felt something shift inside him. For so long, he'd held back, second-guessing his choices, haunted by memories he'd tried to shake. But with Morgan, he felt a growing sense of freedom. It was as if he could let go of the bitterness and replace it with something fresh, something simple and real. One evening, they went to a small outdoor concert together, the music drifting through the warm summer air. As the band played, Morgan turned to him, her face bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. "Nathan, have you ever thought about moving on fully? Letting go of the past?" He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I have, but I guess I wasn't sure how. Part of me held on to the anger, because it was easier than feeling the loss." Morgan nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I get that. I used to think holding on made me strong, but it just kept me stuck. Sometimes forgiving yourself is the first step." Nathan looked at her, a feeling of peace washing over him. You're right. It's hard to let go, but maybe it's time." They sat in silence, the music wrapping around them like a gentle reminder of how far he'd come. Nathan found himself smiling, feeling lighter, as if he'd finally set down a burden he'd been carrying for too long. Weeks turned into months, and Nathan and Morgan grew closer. Their shared time was filled with laughter, honesty, and the kind of conversations he'd once thought were impossible to find. Morgan's openness and trust were like a balm, healing parts of him he hadn't even realized were wounded. One afternoon, Nathan took her to a quiet park by the river. They sat by the water's edge, the air filled with the sound of birds and the gentle rush of the current. "Morgan," he began, his voice steady, "I just want you to know how much meeting you has changed things for me." She turned to him, a soft smile on her lips. "I feel the same way, Nathan. I didn't expect to meet someone like you, but I'm glad I did." He took her hand, feeling a warmth spread through him. "For so long, I thought I'd never be able to trust again. But you've shown me what trust can be when it's real." She squeezed his hand, her gaze steady. "It's scary sometimes, isn't it? But I think the best things in life usually are." They sat there, hand in hand, letting the silence settle around them. For the first time, Nathan felt at peace, truly ready to leave the past behind. Looking back, Nathan felt grateful, not for the betrayal or the heartbreak, but for the lessons that came with them. He had found strength he hadn't known he possessed and learned the value of patience and self-respect. And now, with Morgan by his side, he felt like he was truly living, free from doubt or fear. As they left the park together, Nathan caught Morgan's eye, his heart full of hope. For the first time, he wasn't haunted by memories or the pain of a broken trust. Instead, he looked forward to the journey ahead, knowing he'd found someone who valued the same things he did, someone who would stand by him without hesitation. It wasn't a second chance with Zara, nor did he want it to be. It was a second chance with himself, with life, and now with Morgan. And that he knew was worth everything. Nathan's life had finally settled into a calm he hadn't thought possible. He and Morgan shared quiet mornings, meals filled with laughter, and long talks about the future. But sometimes, when he sat alone, memories would float back, tinged with the bitterness he'd buried. One crisp autumn evening, he drove to the scenic overlook where he used to go to think, just outside the city. He parked the car, stepping out onto the gravel path, the breeze ruffling his hair. Standing on the edge of the overlook, he gazed down at the city lights below, feeling a strange sense of closure. Far across town, Zara's life had become something of a dark mirror of Nathan's. She spent her days in a dull routine, the fallout from her actions gnawing at her constantly. Friends had distanced themselves, her career was stunted, and whispers still followed her wherever she went. Even her family looked at her differently now, never saying much but showing their disappointment in small, silent gestures. That evening, she sat alone in her quiet apartment. She scrolled through her phone, pausing on photos of her and Nathan from happier times. They looked happy, full of a warmth she could hardly remember. She missed that sense of security, the knowledge that someone was there for her, no matter what. Sean's absence was conspicuous too, but he was the last person she wanted to talk to. After Nathan exposed them, Sean's career took a serious hit. People in their circles avoided him, viewing him as an instigator. Zara had tried to reach out to him in the beginning, thinking that maybe they could find solace together. But he had become bitter, blaming her for everything, leaving her to pick up the pieces alone. At the Overlook, Nathan breathed in the cool air, exhaling slowly. He hadn't come here to relive old wounds, but to reflect, finally, with a sense of peace. For so long, he'd carried the weight of Zara's betrayal, allowing it to define him, to shape his thoughts and influence his actions. But now, with Morgan, he'd found a place of calm, a life where trust was not a question, but a given. He closed his eyes, remembering Zara's pleas, her desperation. He remembered the nights he spent questioning what he'd done wrong, wondering if he'd somehow failed as a husband. Those questions, once so sharp and painful, now seemed distant, like voices calling from a storm that had finally passed. Meanwhile, Zara's regret had transformed into something else, a heavy, inescapable loneliness. She thought about reaching out to Nathan, hoping he might one day forgive her. Perhaps they could share a coffee, talk about old times, even laugh, though she knew he'd probably moved on. Yet the prospect of facing him, seeing the happiness he'd rebuilt without her, scared her more than anything. She texted her old friend, Claire, the one person who hadn't completely abandoned her. They'd known each other since college, and Claire had been there through the fallout, gently reminding her of what she'd lost. "Do you think I could ever make things right?" she asked, waiting anxiously for a reply. After a few minutes, Claire responded, "Maybe, but some things don't go back to how they were. Sometimes, you have to forgive yourself and accept the past." Zara put the phone down, sighing. She had forgiven herself in some ways, she thought, but the past wouldn't let her forget. Nathan stayed at the Overlook until the sky darkened and the stars began to appear. He didn't feel anger anymore, only a kind of bittersweet acceptance. He had loved Zara, and he'd been willing to give everything for her, but sometimes people didn't fit in each other's lives the way they thought they would. That betrayal had been the darkest moment of his life, but it had also led him here, to a place of clarity, where he was no longer defined by his past. Just as he was about to leave, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Morgan. "Home soon? I have a surprise for you." He smiled, typing back, "On my way. Can't wait." Nathan put his phone away, giving one last look at the view. It felt like he was leaving something behind, the weight of his old life slipping off his shoulders, leaving him lighter, unburdened. As he turned, he felt a finality that hadn't been there before, a sense that he'd finally moved beyond the pain, that he'd truly started over. And as he drove back to Morgan, he didn't look back, content with the life he was building and the lessons he'd learned. Back in her apartment, Zara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her choices. She'd never fully understood what she'd had with Nathan until it was gone. And while regret filled her thoughts, she knew that some things could never be undone. She glanced out the window, seeing the city lights in the distance. Somewhere out there, Nathan was living a new life, one that no longer included her. She knew he was better off, and maybe, in some way, so was she.